Kia ora koutou. Welcome back to day 2 of the 2025 New Zealand Economics Forum. Good to see everybody bright and early. And for those of you that were here last night, it was a fantastic discussion with former Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison. So thank you for being a part of that. And I hope everybody else had a lovely evening as well. All right, we're going to kick into the first session of the day in just 1 minute, but I'll give you a quick overview of how this morning will run. First, we will hear from the new Treasury Secretary, Iain Rennie. We will then take a decent break. We'll give a decent amount of time for people to catch up and refresh. We then go into our morning panels, parallel panels between Pharmac and medicines, balancing politics and public health, and Kiwi schools, what are we doing right or wrong? A brief break, and then a couple more really key sessions, one on the energy sector and transition, and finishing with geopolitics and defence, which has already been a theme through day 1. We'll get everybody out of here by 1 o'clock. So that's how today will run. This session will be a keynote followed by Q&A on the stage here. So again, you can feed questions through to me via the app on Slido. So I'd like now to do a brief introduction to Iain Rennie. Iain was appointed Secretary and Chief Executive to the New Zealand Treasury in November 2024, so maybe coming up 100 days. An accomplished economist and public service leader, he has extensive expertise in macroeconomic policy, fiscal management, and public sector reform. From 2016 to 2024, Iain worked internationally, advising national and state governments on economic and public sector reform. Previously, he had led the Public Service of New Zealand as State Services Commissioner and served as Deputy State Services Commissioner as well. Iain began his career at the New Zealand Treasury in 1986 as an economic and financial analyst. He served as an economic advisor to Prime Minister Jim Bolger, there you go, and Cabinet from 1990 to 93. During his 10 years as Deputy Secretary at Treasury, Iain oversaw the budget and macroeconomic branch and the regulatory and tax policy branch. He was also more recently, he was also the independent chair of the Financial Statements of Government Audit Committee. So quite the record. And Iain, we'll welcome you to the stage and then look forward to seeing you for some Q&A shortly. Welcome, Iain Rennie.
Tēnā katoa. Thank you, Matt. It's fantastic to be here. I think Brian said yesterday he's at day 100. So that must mean I'm at about day 86. So it's really great to come to this forum early on in my time as Secretary and give you some initial thoughts that I have about some of the challenges that New Zealand has. And I'd like to acknowledge all the leaders who are here, leaders in politics, leaders in organisations, thought leaders in New Zealand. This is a great group of people, and I'm very privileged and humbled to be among you this morning. So our theme is about unconstrained thinking in constrained times. It might be natural to think that the Treasury is more comfortable living in the second half of this conference theme. Constraints are our bread and butter, some might say, in that we will always say there's not enough bread and too little butter. There is some truth to that. If you take the narrow perspective that economics is about scarcity and finance is about balancing the books. But my deep conviction is that the Treasury and all of our colleagues who work there are at our best when we harness that natural caution today in the service of an ambition for tomorrow. So today I'd like to talk a bit about what it means to integrate fiscal and economic advice in New Zealand with an eye to the long term. And as part of that, talk a bit about some of the productivity and fiscal challenges that we see that New Zealand faces in coming years, but also a sense of the broad solutions and policy toolkits that governments over the medium term will have to contemplate to address those issues successfully. So in summary, the crux of my message today is that New Zealand needs to bend two curves. One is the long-term economic growth trajectory, which we need to bend upwards to expand our productive capacity and national real incomes. The second is our net public debt trajectory, which we need to bend downwards to rebuild the fiscal buffers that have been a major source of New Zealand's resilience and ability to respond to shocks over recent decades. These are medium and long-term challenges, but my message is we need to start to address them very soon. The reason I'm focusing on economic growth and fiscal sustainability is that because, in my mind, these issues are really intertwined. They don't sit separately from each other. Achieving higher productivity means New Zealanders' real incomes will be rising over time, as will our national incomes and our ability to effectively fund public services over time. And that last point is really important. This is not a narrow economist view around GDP and let's get the numbers right from an economy point of view. In the real world, higher real incomes mean access to world-class drugs, access to world-class education, ability to deal effectively and in a timely way with the challenges of climate change, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. So higher real incomes is something that we've all got a real vested interest in, and our children and our grandchildren. So that's why I think that's important. Equally, rebuilding our fiscal resilience is crucial to give ourselves the breathing space to address the long-term sustainability of revenue expenditure settings created by population ageing. And to be frank, as a country, we are challenged by successfully handling those issues, and we've made very little progress over the last 3 decades in changing our policy settings in that area. It will also give us confidence that we can weather the shocks we may be subject to in coming years, and New Zealand, because of where we are in the world, we face a whole lot of shocks. We face all the global shocks like pandemics, economic ups and downs. Where we sit on the world, we face tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions. We face, like many countries, the real and present and growing reality of changing climate and what that does in terms of more extreme weather events and changes in our economic and social fabric. So it's really important that we are able to weather those shocks, because as we've seen in New Zealand and what I've seen in countries overseas, is if you don't have fiscal resilience, the price of that is borne by those who are most reliant on public services and therefore are the most vulnerable in our community. So that's why fiscal resilience, again, it's not an accounting concept or something, it's something that's really important in terms of New Zealand being able to be the kind of society that I think we all want it to be. And I don't believe that fiscal sustainability and stronger economic growth are in opposition to each other over the longer term. Productivity and fiscal sustainability aren't the only things that matter. However, I believe that a growing economy and a sustainable fiscal position can unlock a positive sum dynamic in public policy debate where we can think about different ways to share the burdens and seize the opportunities of a changing world. We know that New Zealand will continue to face the buffeting headwinds of global and domestic changes: technological, geopolitical, distributional, environmental, demographic. The Treasury hasn't lost sight of that broader canvas. That is the unconstrained thinking New Zealand needs. But today I want to talk a bit about how to confront the issues that might become constraints if they're not addressed. Like any good financial advisor, our job is to advise about both today and tomorrow, balancing our focus between how we tackle today's pressing needs and preparing and planning to meet tomorrow's challenges and opportunities. I see it as a core part of the Treasury's role, the stewardship role that Brian talked about yesterday in terms of the broader public sector, to be a thought leader and contribute confidently to that policy debate. And throughout 2025, you'll hear a lot more from us. 3 of our statutory stewardship documents will expand on the themes I'm introducing today. In coming months, we'll release the draft of our long-term insights briefing, which all public service departments are producing. In our case, we will focus on sustainable and resilient fiscal policy over economic cycles. Later in the year, our long-term fiscal statement will explore the implications of ageing and climate change for New Zealand's fiscal sustainability. And towards the end of the year, the investment statement will explore issues around the prudent investment and management of our balance sheet. Alongside this, we will continue to promote our research and perspectives on economic performance and policy, as we all do through our program of speeches and publications. So in terms of growth, in recent years, most of the developed world has been experiencing a productivity slowdown, from which we have certainly not been exempt. But we also know the underlying issues in New Zealand are long-standing. Labour productivity first fell significantly behind other advanced countries in the 1970s. And as of 2023, New Zealand was ranked 31st for GDP per hour worked of the current 38 OECD members. Over a long period of time, the Treasury and many others have diagnosed and analysed the causes of this decline. There are always nuances in how to interpret these matters, and you can't replay the tape of economic history to test all the grand theories. But on the basis of our long-standing engagement with these debates, we are confident that we understand the basic problem. This understanding can be summarised well by applying a core economic framework known in the parlance as the growth accounting framework. To simplify this, and with apologies to the growth theorists in the room, the framework emphasises the supply-side potential of the economy and underlines that productivity growth emerges from the decisions firms and households make about how they efficiently use, invest in, and combine their capital goods and human capabilities. In the economic equations, these factors are referred to in shorthand: K for capital, L for labour, and MFP, multi-factor productivity. So applying this framework, what do we know? New Zealand's performance on these measures over the last 3 decades strongly suggests that slowing labour productivity growth is likely to reflect declines in the growth of the capital to labour ratio, and slowing growth in MFP and the ability to diffuse new innovations across the economy. And while human capability has been a historical strength for New Zealand in terms of our level of labour force participation and the skills of our people, we are beginning to see some worrying signs that historical strength is beginning to reverse. This is only the barest summary of quite a complex reality, and today I don't want to dwell on diagnosis. As you heard yesterday from the Minister of Finance, the government's already got a significant economic reform program underway with a number of focus areas. What I want to highlight today are 4 areas where Treasury thinks further focus is warranted, where we think policy, together with the actions of the private sector and other sectors in the economy, could really make an impact over the long term. Firstly, private investment and capital intensity. New Zealand's low capital intensity is a key driver of our poor productivity performance. New Zealand has much lower levels of capital per worker than OECD countries we compare ourselves to. Increasing this ratio would mean workers can use more and better technology to do their jobs, which will increase productivity. While investment has been on an upward trend since 2007, it has not kept pace with our expanding workforce. What are the causes of this? We see several. One is New Zealand's high cost of capital, and that's partly due to relatively high tax rates on businesses, including on inbound investment and also high real interest rates. Our taxation of investment is also uneven, which distorts investment choices. Such economic settings can discourage the acquisition of productivity-enhancing assets like machinery and equipment. This suggests that the policy responses are likely to include those that create an environment more conducive to firms making those kinds of investments. This could be through the structure of business taxation, savings policy, and regulatory frameworks that keep pace with business changes and create certainty for investment in emerging sectors. The second area of focus that we think is important are our connections to the world. New Zealand, being small and remote, faces unique economic challenges, including limited domestic competition, difficulties in scaling up businesses, and poor connections to global markets. These factors hinder the country's capacity to attract foreign direct investment, which is crucial for bridging the gap between national savings and investment needs, particularly important for improving capital intensity and addressing infrastructure deficits. New Zealand's foreign direct investment stock is below the OECD average, 38% of GDP compared to 50% in 2022 for OECD as a whole, indicating room for growth through policy reform. During the late 1990s, New Zealand's FDI peaked at 59% of GDP, surpassing the OECD median at that time. Since then, New Zealand has experienced a decline in FDI growth, with an annual decrease of 0.5% per annum, while the OECD has grown by 4% per annum. Restrictive regulatory frameworks such as the Overseas Investment Act partly explain New Zealand's low levels of FDI, and as you know, the government has a work program to make some liberalisation in that front. However, the consistent flat rate of FDI across various investment types since the early 2000s suggests that other reforms are necessary. This could include creating a more favourable investment environment for foreign investment, which includes competitive tax settings, a generally positive and stable general business environment, and an available and skilled workforce. The third area that we think is really important is around innovation and the diffusion of new technology. The development and adoption of new ideas and technologies is a driver of growth. Yet New Zealand's business spend on R&D is low compared to our peers, and we could do better at commercialising new inventions. Additionally, New Zealand firms on average tend to be slow to adapt new ideas and technologies from overseas. While there are some very innovative pockets of the New Zealand economy, which are fantastic, these can struggle to reach critical mass. The challenge for policy is working out how best to multiply, broaden, and deepen those pockets of innovation. Evidence suggests that New Zealand has poor innovation outcomes relative to the countries we compare ourselves to. Our most productive frontier firms were less than half as productive as the frontier firms of other small advanced economies in 2016. Competition is one of several factors that can contribute to lifting innovation, which takes me to the fourth and final area of focus that we think is important in coming years, being regulation and a competitive environment. New Zealand is geographically remote, with small, highly concentrated markets. Our markets are often subject to weak competitive discipline, and prices are often high by international standards. Competitiveness requires good competition law and enforcement, but it goes much broader than that. Broader policy and regulatory settings could further business dynamism and productivity in the economy. Improving market and infrastructure settings and maintaining up-to-date and well-performing regulatory systems can give firms more confidence to invest, innovate, and grow. Regulatory systems that are clear, stable, proportionate, and well implemented create certainty for businesses. Overly restrictive regulation, or regulation that is poorly designed and implemented, can create unnecessary costs and be a barrier for new firms wanting to enter a market. Bending our productivity growth curve is an ambitious goal, and the policy implications in some areas are clear, but in others less clear, which is a challenge for all of us who are working in the policy space. But this is a real challenge that we in the Treasury are focused on in coming years. We are blessed with fantastic human capability, business acumen, and natural resources. Our challenge is to keep the country working smarter, and there is no reason why this isn't an appropriate aspiration for New Zealand. So moving from the economic side to the fiscal side and bending that public debt curve down. New Zealand's had a strong record of fiscal discipline since the 1990s. Our debt levels remain well below the historically elevated levels seen in major economies such as the US, the UK, and the Euro area. But to be honest, international comparisons only take you so far. Country context matters a lot. And we have a number of features about where we sit in the world, our structure, our policy settings that argue strongly that our debt levels should be lower than many of our peers. Public debt as a percentage of GDP in New Zealand has risen from its low in 2008 to near the average levels seen in other small and medium-sized developed countries. So you could say New Zealand is certainly not a high debt country, but we aren't a very low debt country anymore either. Why has this happened? The short answer is that we've gone through 15 years of multiple shocks, and successive governments have used the Crown's fiscal headroom to help New Zealand respond and bounce back. So debt levels have ratcheted upwards following the global financial crisis in 2008, the Canterbury earthquakes, and COVID-19. The overall fiscal cost of the earthquakes and the pandemic alone have been estimated approximately 10 and 20% of GDP, respectively. And although there have been efforts to repair the resulting fiscal deficits, the long-term average for the operating balance has reduced significantly over the period. Though we will never be able to predict specific shocks, our fiscal strategy should expect that we will confront shocks of some form. A reasonable starting point is that the fiscal cost of future shocks will be broadly in line with recent history, resulting in a fiscal cost of 10% of GDP per decade. Or to put it more simply, we should assume over the next decade that one or more shocks will essentially add up to broadly the same cost as the Crown's contribution to rebuilding Canterbury after the 2010-2011 earthquakes. And that assumption obviously is never built into our forecast. So we have a built-in, if you like, debt optimism in the forecast that you see from the Treasury. There's also always a matter of judgment about what the prudent level of debt is, and that is rightly the role of government. But the Treasury's clear view is that fiscal consolidation is required to build resilience against the shocks and cycles we are likely to face in future decades. This view is also informed by the chronic pressures on sustainability of public finances, in addition to the pressure from acute shocks. As set out by the Treasury in successive long-term fiscal statements, an ageing population is projected to result in substantial increases in expenditure on superannuation and healthcare if current policy settings are maintained. In addition, increased expenditure is likely required to address New Zealand's long-standing infrastructure deficits and to ensure that the current stock of assets is well maintained. Ultimately, all of this requires a period of sustained operating surpluses over the medium term. At the moment, we're starting with a structural operating deficit of more than 2% of GDP. This means that after stripping out the effects of economic shocks and the business cycles, the underlying trends in operating expenditure exceed our incoming revenue. The Treasury estimates that the government has been in structural deficit since 2019-20, and in Haifu, our last set of forecasts in December, we forecast that the situation will continue until 2028, 2029. So this is a problem. Our public debt right now is not troublingly high, but action is needed to address structural deficits and respond to medium-term fiscal pressures associated with an ageing population. The current government has committed to concrete steps to address this structural deficit, and this will require ongoing and significant reprioritisation of spending to maintain expenditure within forecast operating allowances. The Treasury will support the government to implement this strategy as part of our role in leading the budget process across government. And of course, it is critical that this reprioritisation supports more efficient delivery of public services over the long term, and many of the issues that Brian talked about yesterday. But what I want to emphasise today is that based on what we know about the longer term trends and experience from other countries, simply limiting spending growth in the short term and delivering existing services more efficiently will not be enough. Achieving medium-term fiscal sustainability will require choices by successive governments, which looks at the underlying policy settings that are the sources of growing cost pressures and transfer spending, or considering more sustainable ways to fund those pressures. Past consolidations have tended to require sustained effort, this is what we understand from other countries, and have typically required a mix of policy measures to increase revenue, reform transfers and subsidies, promote efficient use of the government's balance sheet, and reduce government consumption. Consistent with the lessons learnt from past consolidations, our focus is to ensure that consolidation has an enduring impact on fiscal sustainability while supporting long-run economic performance. This will require integrated fiscal and economic strategy advice that considers how different consolidation options will impact on long-run economic performance and how to manage situations where levers to bend the economic curve, such as changes to tax settings or to increase public investment, could have an impact on our ability to bend the fiscal curve. Keeping visibility of the intertwined economic and fiscal challenges to ensure that policy is coherent and well-aligned will be really important. Governments over time will differ in their priorities across the relative balance of expenditure changes, revenue reform, and the balance sheet. The trade-offs are complex. For example, decreasing expenditure can risk decline in service quality and/or large distributional impacts on affected groups, while measures to increase revenue can negatively impact long-run economic performance. So it is right for the broader public to understand what those trade-offs are and for views to differ on how to tackle them across the political spectrum. Through our stewardship work, we feel we have a core role in informing that debate. We need a secure understanding of the scale of the challenge and the options that will need to be on the table. These choices aren't easy. However, inaction itself is a choice. And the cost of inaction is that it tightens the policy constraints over time. And this means that the trade-offs become sharper and the adjustments become more drastic for our community than they need to be. So in conclusion, today I've tried to focus on some of our Treasury's perspectives, to be open about the way we see the world, and to contribute to a debate about unconstrained thinking. But of course, we will always have a primary responsibility to serve the government of the day. Governments need to make progress in the here and now. Our job is to advise them on which pathways are the best to start walking down. We do think hard about a coherent program, drawing on evidence and judgment, but we also remain mindful of the uncertain connections between policy changes and policy outcomes when you look out over the horizon. Over time, governments will choose to stride faster or slower down those paths. The important thing is to keep taking those steps and maintain momentum across a broad front of economic and fiscal policy frameworks. Thanks very much.
Iain. All right. So there's a lot that you've just covered, and while obviously you spent earlier parts of your time in Treasury, no doubt it's been a bit of a whirlwind few weeks. Can I start with one, and it came through on the app, but it's something that I've been thinking about too. Sometimes we hear the statement from politicians or other leaders or thinkers that given our natural conditions, New Zealand should be one of the wealthiest countries in the world. We've got all these natural attributes in a physical sense, but we also have stable political institutions, we speak English, all of these sorts of things. Do you think that's valid? We sometimes compare ourselves to Singapore and Ireland. They both happen to be on the edge of very, very large population masses. In Singapore, you've got most of the world's shipping going past its front door. Do you think that's a realistic thing, given our basic starting point?
Firstly, I think we should take pride in a lot of our institutional settings. Last few years I've worked overseas, and one of the things that I've valued more and more is the ability to live in a liberal democracy where there's debate, where there's broad freedoms, And actually, to be honest, that's not a direction which much of the world is going in at the moment, unfortunately. So I think there's things about who we are and how we work that we should treasure and be incredibly proud of. And they not only help us in a broad societal sense, but they do matter in an economic sense. Institutions do really matter. Rule of law, stable institutions, capable public services. These are things that give people confidence to go about their lives, to invest, for businesses to do their business. And so it's a really important part of how we respond. At the same time, we need to be recognised that, where we sit in the world makes our job to earn lots of income a bit harder. We're not like Singapore and Ireland in terms of we lack some of their proximity to large markets. We have to work harder to get that connectedness. That's not impossible, but what I think it means is that we have to be very clear-eyed about both our strengths, but also our vulnerabilities. And every country has its vulnerabilities. And around those vulnerabilities that we need to keep working hard over time and consistently around the policy frameworks that will mitigate risks or create opportunities. Because I think one of the things, particularly in the growth space, we know that there's no silver bullet. We know that better outcomes are, to some extent, a combination of many things working well, but also there is, as I said in the speech, uncertainty between changing policy and understanding what the policy outcomes will be, which is why you need that ongoing momentum evaluation about what's working, what's not working, and change and dynamism to ensure that we harness our strengths, but we also kind of manage our vulnerabilities.
Thank you. Another question that came through from the audience, but it ties into a theme I was thinking about listening to you, was decades ago, 40 years ago, New Zealand was seen as having well-functioning markets in several areas. It might have been food, banking, electricity, the three that Minister Nicola Willis talked about yesterday. You also made the point that foreign direct investment, it peaked at a certain point and has been declining, while in other developed economies it's been increasing. What's gone wrong, or framed a little bit less negatively, what changed? What do you think changed in either our view of the world economically or our political or social environment that led us to go off on a different path?
Well, I think there's a couple of things around. I mean, the point about competition, the first point I'd make is I think some of the experiences in New Zealand are not unique to us. And I think there's our understanding about the ability of markets to be contestable and competitive, I think, is changing over time. And that, benefit of hindsight, some of the decisions by regulators to allow consolidation in some markets may not be happening today. And so we can beat ourselves up and say it shouldn't have happened. But, I think we've learned a lot more about economics, more about markets, and we just need to deal with the reality that we are. I think part of it's also that we know that in terms of economies have become much more service-oriented. We're much less focused on goods and much more on services. And around services, we know that a lot of those markets are highly regulated in different ways, whether it's through occupational licensing, whether it's formal regulation and things like financial services. So that whole concept about markets which are regulated, are subject to some degree of dominance, are becoming more important in terms of overall economic performance as the structure of the economy changes. On the point about FDI, I think the point I'd make is we know there's a number of elements that seem to matter in terms of policy. What I would say over the last 20, 25 years is that in general, many of our peer countries have moved to change the balance of their tax systems in a way that have overall lowered the burden on taxation of capital. and therefore have become more attractive in terms of a source of inbound investment. That hasn't happened in the New Zealand context to the same degree. So, we've also made some, policy choices and judgments which have made the FDI story a bit more difficult.
Oh, thank you. Another one that came through, and you touched on this in your speech, and questions have come in, and it's the interplay between debt and the climate. So we're now, I think you said, about average on debt. We were, 2008, very low. Of course, that had been declining since the late 80s. One of the reasons we often talk about in public that we don't want to have too much debt is to have resilience to potential climatic or earthquake shocks. So I think you made the point that the Treasury assumption is currently that the kind of shocks we might be exposed to are similar to the ones we've had in the last 10 or 20 years. The challenge is, given the last 4 or 5 years, is that a reasonable assumption, or do we actually need more resilience for potential future shocks, given a changing climate? Or the flip side of that, because some in the room will be saying, we've still got pretty low debt. Why don't we actually just borrow the money to build the infrastructure to make us more resilient? How's Treasury thinking about that?
I think there's a couple of ways to it. I mean, I think certainly we would say in Treasury we definitely need to think a bit about mechanisms. We recognise the risks around resilience and how best do we fund them? How best do we insure against them? And the risk of extreme climatic events is a reality, and it's only becoming more important, and that's a challenge for central government, but there's also a debate about to what extent are those risks shared between central government, local government, and the private sector, and what's the kind of form of, if you like, insurance that best handles that. And part of that is the balance sheet directly, part of it is kind of other insurance mechanisms that could be designed. So I think that's part of it. I think the thing we keep coming back to is, and motivated policymakers in the 90s, is that we're trying to keep debt low, not just for the shocks, but we know we've got these very big medium-term drivers around pensions and healthcare. So one of our concerns is that we don't just end up ratcheting up our debt to meet pressures from various kinds of shocks, and then we still haven't faced those long-term policy pressures. So it's a matter of it's a matter of balance. Good investment is really important, and we'd say in the Treasury, we value that and we recognise that. Brian says we don't recognise in our spreadsheets, but I probably beg to differ. But we're also very cognizant of these, the big elephants in the room about pensions and healthcare settings over the medium term, and needing to bring those back into the picture as well.
So can I pick up on those? Because when you look at the ageing population, pensions and healthcare, there was a statistic I got from your colleague Dominic Stevens in his reading. In the 60s, we had about 7 people in the working age bracket, so call it late teens to 64, for every person aged 65 or over. So 7 working people to fund a person in retirement age. Today, there are only 4 people funding that person, and in 50 years, the ratio will be 2 people funding that retired person. We all know about an ageing population, but the statistic hits hard. What's your view, and this is obviously, there's a political challenge, but what's the free and frank advice you would give to government around pensions, healthcare, changes to superannuation?
I think. Firstly, our views on pensions have been out there for a long time. So there's a mix between reforming public pensions, which are relatively generous. One of the stats I think is really interesting is that we have the highest percentage of 65 to 69-year-olds in paid work in the OECD. It's a bit over 50%, which raises an equity issue. If you're a 25-year-old earning $80,000 a year, you work next to a 65-year-old who earns $80,000 a year but also gets a $20,000 pension from the government. It's not just a fiscal issue, it's also an equity issue. So there's reform there. There's a need to probably bolster the role of workplace savings, particularly KiwiSaver, in terms of supporting New Zealanders to access essentially private retirement income. And then the really hard issue is how do you balance the transition? What is the right balance between younger workers today paying higher taxes to essentially older New Zealanders for a benefit that they themselves won't receive 2 or 3 decades down the track. And it's obviously the span of politics, but I think policy could do a better job about highlighting that. In terms of health, I think there's a much better story we can help policymakers, because at the moment health just looks like a big black box. How do you influence it as a policymaker? And what I think we are seeing in other countries are beginning to pick some bits of that issue which relate to population ageing, funding of aged care. So in Australia, for example, there's been a recent very big reform, which is quite important reform about their fiscal position over the medium term around aged care, but also around disability. And disability for us pops up in a whole lot of areas, whether it's MSD, health, ACC, but it is quite connected to the issue about population ageing, and I think there's more work that we can help to both analyse that, but also give policymakers some better tools that they can then make choices for over the longer term.
It feels it's only going to get more in the political sphere. Yep. All right, we don't have too long, but there are two last questions I want to ask, and I guess they're pulling back a little bit. I was very struck yesterday talking with Minister Willis about the Going for Growth plan and the different elements of looking at that, whether that's talent and skills, investment and international trade, etc. That those things, none of those take 18 months to solve. They're decade-long, they're 2 or 3 decade-long in some cases, changes, and our political cycles are much shorter. From your position in Treasury, in some sense, you need to put political cycles out of your mind or your team's minds. Do you have any things that, if you could, you would love to enshrine and say, look, we're just going to lock these in a bipartisan way or whatever way over 2 or 3 political cycles that you think would make the most difference?
I think. Well, firstly, predictability in the policy environment is a good thing. We know that. So the more agreement around big policy issues, I think there's a value to that. But at the same time, as I said in my speech, there are very legitimate and different ways to look at the problems that I've talked about and come up with solutions. So the idea about everyone coming up with a bipartisan agreement around everything, it's just not going to happen. And in a thriving democracy, you wouldn't expect that, to happen. I think, what you do want from, I think go back to what I said in the speech about those issues where if we don't get agreement, you will really impact on the most vulnerable in the community. Those would be areas that I'd prioritise. That would say being clear over the long term what you want to do around pensions and having a clear and agreed pathway to transition, and also in terms of some of these issues around both health and disability over the long term, because the risks if we don't get some agreement across parties is that those are the people that are going to be hurt at some point through some more precipitate policy actions, whatever they are, down the track. So those would be the kinds of areas that I'd probably say, look, if we can at least get a broad measure of agreement, accepting that there will always be differences of views, I think we will be stronger as a country as a result.
Yeah, thank you. So last question before we wrap and we give everyone a break. You worked in Treasury early in your career, and you were there in a really interesting time and in the PM's office at a period, the tail end, but still a lot of big reforms going on. Coming back into an organisation that in one sense you grew up in, what's changed in both the external context facing Treasury and what's changed in Treasury itself? What do you observe as a person having been away, out doing other things and coming back in?
Well, firstly, it's a much. When I left Treasury, it was like 350 people, and now there's over 600. And there are some additional functions, but it is a bigger organisation. And I haven't quite worked out what's driven all of that quite yet. So it's bigger. I think, and Brian talked a little bit about this yesterday, and I think I wouldn't make this comment in a specific Treasury sense. But when I came into the public sector, it was a sort of very, in some ways, a very crazy time. You know, it was sort of like policy reform on steroids, and there was all kind of both some great stuff that was done, but to be honest, some weird stuff that was done as well. But it was a very exciting time for a young person to come in, and I suppose I got reform in my DNA at that stage. I now work with colleagues who are, you know, as bright or brighter than my generation, but have come in a world where thinking about change, it's longer, it's takes more time, it's more incremental, and I think some of that, as a result, there's a bit loss of curiosity. And Brian talked a bit about this yesterday, and I see a bit of that, and both in Treasury, but also across the system as a whole. So what I think is, 2025 is very different than 1985, and we acknowledge that it's not back to the future. But actually, I think what we want to do is say, look, these policy challenges that we face today, they're as big and hairy and confronting as the policy challenges that the 80s and 90s policymakers got. What's the kind of way in which curiosity and ability to say, yes, we can do this, we can make a difference to our country, and use that to kind of empower and lead people is what I'm really keen to do within the Treasury. A challenge I've said to the Treasury when I came in at my mihi whakatau is that when the Crown came to New Zealand, they set up two departments in 1840. One was Customs, and the second was Treasury, and there's always a debate about which came first. But we've been here since 1840. So part of my challenge to the Treasury is come 2040, that's a really big year for New Zealand in terms of the 200 years since the treaty was signed. But for us, it'll be the start of our third century. And there's very few institutions in this country that will be able to say we're into our third century. And so my challenge is, what's the kind of organisation as we head to 2040 that we want to do, because the investments to achieve that need to be made in the next 5 or so years, which I'll be around. So for me, and I found that really engaging with our staff, because they kind of are quite committed, because they will be the leaders in 2040, won't be me. And so that's really what I'm trying to sort of create for us as a Treasury, to sort of say, when we look out at these longer term issues, how best do we serve the people of New Zealand and have that very vibrant and exciting experience to make our contribution alongside others.
Great. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you to Iain Rennie.
Thank you.